The following is a real recording of a real coaching session. If you're interested in getting some coaching yourself, you can find the link in the description. Thanks and enjoy the video. So I think we are all set. So talk me through how you felt about the assessment. I know it's a long, arduous kind of a thing to fill out, but how did it feel?
Yeah. It was pretty tough.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was a lot more than what I anticipated for sure.
Mhm.
I mean, in general, I think I knew a lot of it. I didn't go as technical as you did in your answers. There was some stuff I didn't know, some stuff I
Mhm.
was not well versed in, but
Mhm.
in general, I think I knew, at least a little bit about most of it, if
Sure.
that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. And I think the overarching kind of conclusion that I would come to over all of it is I think a lot of your instincts are in the right place, but I think the main thing that needs shoring up is there's a lot of aspects of theory that are kind of lacking or missing or not fully fleshed out or not, kind of not sort of understood to the level of detail where it would show up in game. And that's kind of the thing that's going to be important because it's going to lead you down the wrong path sometimes. So what we can do is we'll start off, we'll go through it. We'll just kind of talk through the way that you broke down some of the questions, take a look at some of the notes that I made, and that'll help us to come at it today with a bit more of a clear sense of what some of the main areas are that we want to focus on in the remainder of these sessions. So let me load up a screen share and I will show you. You should be able to see that coming through in just a second. Okay, is that showing up right there? Okay, cool.
Yes.
Yeah, so the first question here about a polarized range, I think the main thing that I would say that is important here is to acknowledge that polarized ranges, even though this definition is accurate here, the primary situations where polarized ranges are going to exist are going to be on later streets, right? It's not going to be that common that we're going to see polarized ranges showing up as part of early street strategies. For the most part, it's going to be something where the primary concern of a polarized range is when we're at the river or to some extent on the turn, and we're not dealing with a scenario where all hands in the deck have plenty of equity, right? That's kind of the thing about this example right here with the ace five off is that the first thing is that ace five off is too weak of a hand to be raising in this early position situation. It's just not a hand that we're ever really going to open from early position. But the second part is that obviously there are some situations where ace five off is going to make middle strength hands, some situations where it's going to make strong hands like this, and so on. And the decisions that we make on the early streets are a product of all of those possibilities, not just this one, obviously. And you're right that it would be in some cases tough for us, for our opponent to think that we have straights on certain runouts. But the main thing here is that the polarization is applying to the range of hands that's actually betting on the later streets. It's not really applying to the pre-flop raising range. So one thing that I would want to talk through, and we'll put this on the agenda for next session, is to flesh out our understanding of polarization by talking about there's a toy game that we use to sort of explain this called the Ace King Queen game. Have you heard of that?
No, I don't guess so.
Okay. So, well, I'll talk you through it next time, but it's just a simplified poker game. It's not a real game, but it's a sort of a thought experiment to help understand and explain the concept of polarized ranges and how they affect our strategy. So we'll go through that next time, and we'll go into how that affects some of our understanding.
So in general, there, real quick, before we
Yeah.
move on. So
Mhm.
when we're talking polarized range, we're talking ranges on layer streets, not pre-flop. Do I understand that?
Generally, yeah. Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, a polarized range it's a conceptual thing. So there are different degrees of polarity, right? So a range can be really, really polarized, which is generally when it's going to apply on the later streets. And you can have a range that is somewhat polarized. So, certain three betting ranges can be polarized to some degree pre-flop. But the key thing about a polarized range is that there are hands that are distinct, excuse me, within that range, there are hands that are distinctly benefiting from getting action from worse hands. And then there are hands that are distinctly benefiting, excuse me. Sorry.
You're good.
And then there are also hands that are distinctly benefiting from getting folds from better hands. And the thing about pre-flop raising is that anytime we're just making a basic pre-flop raise, it's mostly, other than the very, very strongest hands, it's mostly not distinctly a value bet or distinctly a bluff in the sense
That makes sense.
Right. Yeah. So if we raise with ace five off, kind of like I didn't explain it correctly the first time, but if we raise with ace five off, then there are a number of different board textures where ace five off is going to be a very strong hand, but there's also a number where it's going to be a very weak hand. And in those cases, sometimes it might be value betting, it might be bluffing, but pre-flop, as a basic pre-flop raise, it's not value betting or bluffing. It's just raising because we raise a range of hands that gives us multiple options, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Cool. Yeah. And then the second question here is interesting because your understanding of ICM in terms of a practical sense is not incorrect at all. Like everything here is accurate in terms of the big stack being able to put pressure on. The small stacks can put pressure on the middle stacks. That it's kind of true, but it does depend on the exact nature of the stacks, but it's broadly true. The thing that's missing a little bit here is an explanation of the nature of what ICM actually is. And the thing that I'm kind of looking for them from the response here is clarification that ICM it's a model and it's not a strategy in itself, right? So it's a mathematical model that changes how we evaluate what the best decision is. And it isn't in itself a strategy that says you should do this, right? And that kind of is important to understand because the aspect of folding more on the bubble, even that in itself is oversimplification because there are different degrees of folding more on the bubble, right? There are situations where we're going to fold slightly more, and then there are situations where we're going to fold significantly more, right? So this essentially is an oversimplification, kind of boiling ICM down to a strategy of being tighter. And you correctly identified that obviously it's not always the case that we have to be tighter, but to go even further than that, we want to kind of identify that it's a sliding scale, throughout the spectrum of ICM because ICM itself is not one strategy. It's a model that helps us to decide a strategy, basically. Does that make sense?
Yes, understood.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. This one here, this is definitely reasonable strategy. What you came up with, your range betting here for a small size is going to work really well on this board. It's going to be totally fine. And the point of this question was to kind of, it's like check in with whether or not you could correctly recognize that this was probably a range bet spot. So in terms of the actual answer that you came to, all seems good. There are a couple of things about some of these ranges that might be a little bit off. Like there's a couple of inconsistencies where, stuff like Jack 6 off being in the opening range here, like this would be a very, very wide button opening range. And I mean, just there's also like small things like you mentioned a lot of the offsuit hands here, but you didn't really mention like how far we're going with the suited hands on the button, stuff like that. So
okay, yeah,
just a couple of maybe things that you just kind of skipped over or forgot, which is not a huge deal. But also just this big blind defending range is definitely very wide, but it's perhaps a little bit almost in the wrong direction in some cases because you can see we've got like king 3 off listed in here. But if we're going to have like king 3 off, queen 4 off, hands like 8-6 off, 7-5 off, hands like that are going to be in there as well, right? So there's some slight tweaks we might want to make to those actual strategies. The only other thing that I would want to include here as well is really just an explanation of why we have a range bet, right? So you're not wrong that we do have a range bet, but why is the important part here. So talk me through, if you can right now, just what it was that made you feel like this seems like a good board to range bet here.
Well, first off, the single high Broadway card, I feel like is a good range bet card most of the time, and unless, for instance, we have two connected cards with it. So if it was a queen, 7-8 of diamonds, let's say, that might keep us from range betting a little more. But because
Okay.
it's such a dry board, uh, rainbow board, I just feel like that hits us better than what it would the big blind.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's very accurate. I think largely, a lot of what you said there about, high card Broadway type boards, like all that's going to be very true. The element that I would want to add to that, or the element that we can talk about in future, and this is again a second thing to kind of put on the list here, is to flesh out why exactly it is that boards that have those properties end up being boards where range bet is a good strategy. And a lot of it relates to the number of weak hands in our opponent's range specifically that are going to have either an easy fold or a close decision against a small bet. And, relative to a large bet, if we were to bet large on Queen 7-3, a lot of the time the big blind would have, a huge number of just trivial folds, right? We don't want to give them too many trivial folds in situations like this. So we'll flesh that out later for sure. But everything is kind of heading in the right direction with your assumptions here for sure. So we just want to kind of supplement that with an understanding of why these things are what they are, basically. So
okay,
that's all good. Then we've got this one, which is kind of an extension of the previous one. All of this is very good. I'm glad that you immediately kind of went straight to the objective factors here, which is position and stack size, the first two here. Opponent, multi-way. Certainly multi-way is going to affect things for sure because the number of players, again, that's an objective aspect of the spot. The one thing that I would say about incorporating reads on our opponent like this, let's say, is that in a tournament context, it's quite rare that you're going to have enough of an understanding of an individual opponent that you can make a significant adaptation to that specific player. And a lot of the time, we're going to end up sort of being overly assumptive if we try to do that too frequently. So what I would probably say in general would be that I would shift this around a little bit to where the subjective factors like, what's the type of opponent we're up against, which is not an objective thing. It's not a factual thing. That's going to come after we've considered all of the factual elements. And it's also going to be much more about the tendencies of the player pool as opposed to the individual player that we're actually up against. So that's
okay.
another aspect that we can talk about later. Out of position players should not have as many continuation bets. That is, this sentence is definitely broadly very accurate. Stack size so this next one is interesting. So I did highlight in my comment here, your stack size could determine your continuation betting by betting more with say 100 big blinds compared to 20 big blinds. Did you mean, when you say betting more, did you mean betting more often or did you mean betting bigger sizes?
Let's see, your stack size could determine your stack size. Let me think here. Your stack size could determine your continuation bet by betting more. So a larger size is what I'm talking about there. Yep.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. And I think that's pretty reasonable. I think a lot of the time, obviously, because we're, if we're shallow stacked, we're going to have kind of some limitations on how big we can bet. We don't need to bet as big. I wanted to clarify that because of this factor that I mentioned here, which is that at deeper stacks, we actually don't do generally as much C betting. It's a marginal change, but it is a change. And it all comes down to the threshold of how wide we can actually stack off being a lot tighter. When we're shallower, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, so like 100 big blind behind or effective rank or effective stack size, I guess. I'm looking at something like 2.3x, right, as opposed to 20 effective stack. I would just bet a two big blind
Well,
bet there.
that we're talking about pre-flop raise sizes there, though. This is about flop continuation bet sizes.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So we're talking about, we're talking about continuation betting here, which is betting the flop after we've pre-flop raised. So,
well, it's still going to be somewhat the same, right? I mean, a smaller stack size, you're not going to bet as much as you would with a larger stack size.
you're right. I'm not saying it's incorrect. I'm just saying that 2 big blinds versus 2.3, like,
Yes,
we
sir.
don't really
Understood.
we don't really determine our C bet sizes in terms of number of big blinds. Once we go post flop, we start talking about it in terms of percentage of the pot.
Percentages, yes.
I just wanted
Yeah.
to clarify that you were talking about. I wanted to make sure that we weren't talking about different things. So yeah,
Yeah, we're on the same page there. I understand.
sure, yeah.
I
Cool.
misspoke there, but yes, we're on the same
Right,
page.
yeah. And the general, the thing that I wanted to highlight here is just this: people have this idea that deeper stacks means play more aggressively, play more hands, and so on and so on. But that's not necessarily how it works. In fact, when we're shallower stacked, because we don't need to have a very strong hand in order to justify stacking off, quite often we get to play more aggressively, do more continuation betting, and so on when stacks are a bit shallower. That's kind of the main sort of highlight here.
Okay.
This one here, your opponent can affect your bet size by their image. That's kind of an add-on here to where you're not wrong, but again, it's just quite rare that you're going to get like a super accurate direct read about your opponent, and there's a lot of complexity to how we actually handle playing against players that have this sort of loose approach anyway. That it's not incorrect. It's just not a primary factor, because the range that we're actually up against is going to be much more important.
Okay.
And then this last one about multi-way pots, yeah, that's generally very accurate there for sure. So this next one is something we definitely will have to cover because it's quite an important concept. Basically, equity realization, it's the way to look at it is obviously every hand has a certain amount of raw equity in any given situation, which is just how often we would win the pot if everything just checked to the river. Equity realization is how much of that raw equity do we achieve, do we win when we take into account the fact that we have to play all the remaining streets, right? So a good example is if we have a small pocket pair, right? We call in the big blind with a small pocket pair. We see a flop. The flop is like king, queen, 3, right? We have pocket 7s. In a spot like that, if it was checked to the river, pocket 7s might have pretty good equity. We might have 50% equity or something against a range of hands. But because pocket 7s has very limited ability to navigate multiple streets and actually make good decisions or kind of understand when we do or don't have the best hand, pocket 7s is going to significantly under-realize its equity in that situation. It's not going to perform as well as it would if we simply checked it down to the river, right? By contrast, if we have a hand that potentially has a draw, a really strong draw or something like that, a hand like that might over-realize its equity because it might have pretty medium equity as well, but that hand is going to be able to bluff more often. It's going to be able to win the pot without showdown. And then when it does make the draw, it's also going to get paid off sometimes. So it's going to win more than what it would win if we just checked it down to the river, right? And the position relationship here basically just refers to the idea that every hand is going to perform better across multiple streets if we're in position compared to out of position. There are a lot of situations where, for example, if we had the pocket 7s on king, queen, 3, if we're in position, we might do quite well because we have the opportunity to just check back if we want, right? But if we're out of position, checking doesn't just guarantee us seeing another street. Checking might cause us to face a bet and so on. So this concept of realization, it correlates or it influences our pre-flop decisions quite a bit. And it also will start to influence our flop decisions and so on, because it tells us a little bit about how different kinds of hands are going to play across multiple streets. And there are mathematical ways of defining this. If we start to look at solvers, we start to see that the relationship between the EV of a hand and the equity of a hand is effectively its equity realization. If our hand is supposed to win half the pot, but once we actually play out the remaining streets, it wins a lot more than half the pot on average, that hand has really good equity realization. But if our hand is supposed to win half the pot and in fact it doesn't win that much very often, has quite bad equity realization. So that's something we will certainly cover in some future situations. Then we've got, okay, so this is, again, none of this is incorrect here, but I think this is an area where we would want to, this is kind of why fleshing out some of the theory is important, because in this second sentence here, it kind of sounds like you're advocating in favor of being imbalanced. And I wanted to clarify that a little bit. I wanted to kind of see if we can explain that a bit more. Do you have any more thoughts you can kind of add to this sentence here?
Well, I mean, in a way, you do kind of want to be imbalanced, right? I mean, you don't want to be, I don't know. I feel like being imbalanced is not a bad thing. It makes it harder for your opponent to play you. Is that not correct?
It's the inverse, right? I mean, if we're imbalanced, right? Imbalanced implies that we have either a lot of value and very few bluffs, or a lot of bluffs and very little value. Both of those are easy strategies to play against.
So yeah, I see what you say. Inverse. So balance would be, okay.
Balanced strategies are more difficult to play against, right? So the second part of this question here, why does imbalance create opportunities for exploitation, is because imbalance, if we're, excessively value heavy or excessively bluff heavy in a certain situation, it allows our opponent to exploit us by changing the way that they play. If we are only going to have value hands, then they just fold a lot. If we're only going to have bluffs or too many bluffs, they just stop folding, right? So that's kind of the area here that we want to highlight about that idea of imbalance. And it also, of course, relates to our opponents as well. If our opponents are imbalanced.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I had it reversed in my head, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah. So
yeah,
I understand what you're saying there. So balance, have as many bluffs as we do value hands, basically, right? So
well, yeah, it's not going to be a one-to-one relationship, because it's going to relate to the kind of pot odds that we're going to be offering our opponent. But when we flesh out some of this theory stuff regarding the ace king queen game, we'll kind of explain this in a bit more detail. But essentially the key thing here about imbalance creating opportunities for exploitation is that not only does it create opportunities for our opponents if we are imbalanced with our betting ranges, but if our opponent is responding in an imbalanced way, if they are, let's say, only raising with value hands or something like that, it also creates opportunities for us to exploit them, right? So the whole idea of exploitation hinges off of understanding where the imbalances are in our opponent's strategy, basically. That's kind of the central idea there. So this question here, equity denial, really, this is not a great question that I put in here. So I don't think we have to worry about this one too much. I'm going to change this question in future. Essentially, you're not necessarily wrong about this definition, although this definition is maybe a bit more of a definition of just bluffing in a simple kind of a way. Equity denial is more about when we have a hand that is a value hand, it's a strong hand, but it also benefits a little bit as a side effect from getting our opponent to fold some hands that are kind of drawing live against that hand. So a good example would be like, if the flop is all low cards, if the flop is 4 deuce deuce, and we have pocket sixes, and we bet the flop, we're still betting for value because we're getting called by worse hands. We're betting because we have a good hand. We're hoping to get called by worse. But we are benefiting to some degree from, if we have pocket sixes and our opponent folds king, queen, that's not that bad of a thing, right? That's kind of a concept that, even though it's not going to be a priority, it's a secondary benefit to betting that is going to help us in a lot of situations. So that's just something that will come up at times. But like I say, not a great question. I think looking back, I would probably change this question. So I wouldn't worry too much about this one. Yeah, this one is kind of a bit similar to the earlier ICM question. This is all very accurate. I would have liked to see maybe a bit of a reference to some of the mechanics of ICM, the way that it works, the way that the model functions. So perhaps there's a little bit we can kind of shore up there in terms of your understanding of the foundations of ICM and how it operates. But just in practical terms, this is very accurate. So nothing too much to worry about there. This one was, yeah, again, this is another question that I think in retrospect, just seeing the way people have answered this one, I don't think it's as clear as it could be. So I am probably going to change this one. But what I was curious about is with your answer here, whether what these questions here, was this you pointing out that the question doesn't provide this information, or was this you actually listing these are the things that I'm considering?
Yeah, what I'm considering.
Okay, yeah, because that's good. These are all relevant questions for sure. These are good good questions to be asking, and you're considering the right kinds of things. The element that I would want to add is to include an explanation here of how these elements are actually going to alter your strategy, right? So you mentioned that the range of villain will be a lot tighter from under the gun and from the button. Yeah, absolutely. How is that going to alter your assumptions about what their value range might look like? You know, what hands might be in their value range in one position that wouldn't in another, and so on. So all of this is correct. All of this is useful, but we want to just kind of go one level deeper and really flesh out how it's actually going to alter our decisions. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. So this one was interesting. The ace king one. Talk me through this one, just kind of looking at it now, like thinking about the idea of flatting ace king. Looking back at your answer here, what do you think were the sort of primary things you were thinking about with this one?
So I remember in your answer, one of the things you said is we can't worry about losing, I think, or something to that effect, right? It's just part of the game.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah, and I understand that. And I don't remember all what your answer said, but what was your question here again? I guess I'm sorry.
Sorry, yeah, I wasn't a, I was a bit vague, I guess, but I guess what I'm kind of getting at here is that you kind of went straight to a situation here where we are, you know, we're kind of facing an open, and we're facing a 3-bet, and then we're thinking about we're not 4-betting, potentially not 4-betting ace king, right? The thing that was interesting to me is that this is first of all, this is a really rare kind of a situation. And it's interesting that I guess I was curious whether, did you go straight to this because this is one of the only situations you could think about where you wouldn't 3-bet or 4-bet ace king, or was it
it's
something
just
else?
what came to mind, right? I mean, because flatting ace king, I'm probably not going to do it very often. And you said explain when flatting ace king is correct, so that's what came to mind. If I'm facing two, very tight players or low VPIP in front of me, ace king you might be behind with ace king. So that's just what came to mind there.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess as an extension of that, are you basically saying that it's really hard for you to think of a situation to flat ace king where it's just you open and somebody 3-bets and you're deciding whether to 4-bet or not? Like, is that kind of the implication there?
I mean, I would call a 3-bet with ace king. I mean, I don't think you're always 4-betting ace king, are you?
Well, that's the whole thing. We're not, but that's not included in your answer. That's the thing. Like, you're correct that there are situations where we would flat a 3-bet with ace king, but you didn't mention that in the answer, right? You didn't mention, like, we open, the kind of the essence of what I was looking at here, or looking for here with the answer really is that the reason why ace king has an incentive to 3-bet or 4-bet in any given situation is because we can get action from worse hands, right? In a very simple way, very straightforward. The reason to 4-bet ace king against a 3-bet is if we think our opponent can call the 4-bet or 5-bet shove with hands that are worse than ace king, right? That's the kind of the fundamental of it. And an example of when flatting ace king would be correct, all it really needs to be is a situation where we think that it would be quite difficult for us to get action from worse hands by 4-betting, right? So you kind of identified there, you're absolutely correct. There are situations where we're going to flat ace king versus a 3-bet against a tight player, things like that. I guess what I was trying to get at is that you're aware that that's the case, but that wasn't the situation that came to mind first here. The situation that came to mind first here was this kind of an unusual sort of low frequency thing where it's like a raise and a 3-bet ahead of us. So I just was kind of trying to see where your head was at there. And then the other thing about this type of situation is that cold calling a 3-bet with a raise and a 3-bet ahead of us is something that we very, very rarely want to do. And even just the fact that this is where your head went here, where it's like, I don't like 4-betting here, but I'm going to flat ace king. If just the simple fact that we're thinking about cold calling 3-bets from middle position here, that's telling me that I would almost guarantee here that you're far too passive pre-flop, simply because of this one answer. Because cold calling a 3-bet in this kind of situation with any hand is not something that is going to be favorable for us. It's not something that's going to really make sense to do. And it's especially the case with a hand like ace king, where if we don't think that the 3-bet range of the under the gun 1 player here, for example, contains a hand like ace queen or contains other hands that ace king is ahead of, then there isn't honestly even that much incentive for us to actually continue with ace king at all. If we're that convinced that these players are very, very tight, there isn't actually much reason to do anything with ace king other than potentially fold. Now it's a really low frequency thing. But I think the general idea that I wanted to hone in on there is that idea of if we're putting more money in the pot with ace king, it's going to be because we can get action from worse, which we will in lots of situations. But you did kind of know the answer there because you highlighted that there are situations where we don't 4-bet it. It's just the reasoning and the reason why that is important there. And then the ICM situation. The thing about ICM is that ICM makes flatting more problematic because the more post-flop play we engage in when we're under ICM pressure, the more each subsequent street of post-flop hurts us further and further, basically. And this is one of the biggest ICM mistakes that people make. It's that they primarily hedge because they don't want to play an all-in pot and lose an all-in pot, but they also don't want to fold. And so they call and then they miss the flop and then they fold. Or they call and then they call the flop and then they fold the turn. And then they just bleed chips and bleed chips and bleed chips. So in fact, it's true that there are some very specific ICM situations where ace king prefers to flat. But in fact, there's a lot of ICM situations where ace king would be quite happy to be all in. And flatting is actually probably the one thing we don't want to do with ace king in those situations. So that's something we'll come across when we start to look at some more ICM type stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what do you say when, and I've heard before, ace king in the end is just a drawing hand, right?
I mean, that's not really a real, that's sort of the kind of thing that's like maybe productive to say like 20 years ago when we didn't really understand where the EV of certain hands came from.
Okay.
Because nowadays we have much more ability to calculate that what it comes down to is if ace king can get significant action from ace queen, that's a great thing. And we should try to do that. If ace king can't get significant action from ace queen, then it's a significantly worse hand, right? I don't think there's anything that we should really categorize as a drawing hand because every hand is this, if you're playing deep stacked and you're not going to be all in pre-flop, every hand is a drawing hand because you have to play multiple streets. You don't have if you're playing post-flop, like it depends what the flop is. There's thousands of different potential flops that are going to exist. And I think that looking at ace king as a drawing hand basically implies that our opponent always has a pair, which is just never true, right? It just can't be true. So what we want to focus on is that the thing that ace king gains EV from is getting action from worse. And if we have the ability to get action from worse, we should do that. We should aim to get that action. If we have the ability to get our opponent to put stacks in with ace queen, then there's no limit of how much money we're willing to put in. If our opponent is putting in 100 big blinds pre-flop with ace queen, we're happy to put in 100 big blinds pre-flop with ace king. But the thing that matters is, are they actually doing that? If they're not doing that, now it becomes a problem, right? And that's the same with any hand. If we have, I don't know, king queen, and our opponent's putting in 100 big blinds with king jack, we're happy to do that, right? But that doesn't sort of tell us in a blanket sense how we should play it. So the idea of those kinds of phrases from a long time back in poker, like we have a lot more understanding of the game now that we don't need to use those,
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. So explanation of what a solver is. All of this is accurate, and it isn't, none of it is incorrect, but it's also a little bit. I think I guess there's two things. I think the first thing is that it isn't really a detailed description of what a solver is, because really a solver is it's not necessarily a tool that will tell you how to play any given hand. It's a calculator, right? It's a glorified calculator that can do incredibly advanced calculations, and it won't tell you how to play any given hand necessarily. What it will do is it will respond to the inputs that you give it, right? When you're using a solver, you're using it's the same as using a calculator. If you're using a calculator, you have to plug in the calculation you're doing. If you're using a solver, you have to do the same thing. So it is it's not incorrect to say that it can tell you how to play any given situation, but the more accurate, I think, description of it would be to identify and hone in on the idea that it is basically a tool that we use to do calculations that are so advanced that a human could never do them, essentially, if that makes sense. And then the second thing is that uploading hands and things like that is definitely not the primary way of using solvers, or the most important way of using solvers. In fact, I would say it's probably one of the least important. This is definitely more important. So, running trainer drills and things like that, that's certainly a valuable way to use solvers. But in essence, the purpose that solvers serve is to help us understand the underlying mechanics of how poker actually works, because we're playing an incredibly complex game, and the calculations necessary to figure out what's truly going on in a hand of poker and where the EV is exchanged, who's making money, who's losing money, they're too complex for a human to do, like I mentioned. So the solver is helping us to understand some of those underlying mechanics and heuristics that we can use to make our decisions more easily and more effectively in future situations. So again, these are both things that we can use it for, but I would say this is definitely, the uploading hands part is definitely a low priority, and the trainer is a very useful thing, very good thing, but the main thing is understanding those mechanics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, explain what you mean by the mechanics.
Okay, so a mechanic would be an example of a trend in where the math is, because a solver is essentially, like I say, because it's a calculator, it's not any strategy that it comes up with, it's not expressing it in human language. Its logic is just pure brute force math, right? All it's doing is just massive calculations. I have a server in my office right here doing calculations for me right now. Like, it's literally just brute forcing its way to an answer. And when we're coming up with interpretations of these answers, a mechanic would be something that we notice that might be a trend that tends to exist where, we can see that when the board texture is kind of like this, the solver likes to do this. You sort of mentioned it earlier with the Queen 7-3 board where high card, 2 low cards, you correctly identified that these are good boards for us and things like that. Well, using a solver, we can go in and investigate and mechanically identify what is it that makes these boards good? What is it that mathematically defines who's going to make money on these boards? And why is it that we can make more money than our opponent can on these boards, and so on? So mechanics like that and heuristics that can help us to actually say, if X, then do Y, right? If this happens, then we should usually do this. Or when this happens, we should consider these factors or things like that. Those mechanics that are in play, they're expressed mathematically. They're expressed through bet sizes. They're expressed through who wins the pot, equity, things like that. We can't talk in math in a human way. So those mechanics and the way that we understand them comes through taking that math and the brute force logic of the solver and converting it into language and something we can discuss, we can explain to each other, we can talk about, we can see how it applies in practice. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. You can think of it a little bit like understanding something related to, economics or something, right? If you look at trading algorithms nowadays, like they use AI to do all kinds of stock market trades and things like that. And algorithms are so complex that it would be incredibly difficult to explain to somebody exactly how an algorithm works. But if you dug into the mechanics of how a trading algorithm makes decisions, you would be able to see, oh, okay, it likes to do this quite often, or it likes to do that, or it prefers making this kind of decision, and so on and so on. So you can start to tease out these trends in these heuristics over time. So this next one, sitting on 30 big blinds, 50% of the field. So this was, I was interested in the response with this one. So you're right that we're 50% of the field remaining, we're not in an ICM position. That's good. I'm glad you identified that. Talk me through a bit more detail here by what you meant with playing almost any 2 cards in the big blind, because this is actually wider than what you mentioned earlier. If we scroll back to this question here with the big blind defense range, this big blind defense range here, this is definitely not almost any 2 cards. This is a wide range, but this is not almost any 2 cards. So your answer to that question is it's kind of implying that when you say almost any 2 cards here, it almost implies that your defending range in this spot would be wider than the other spot. So can you flesh that out for me a bit?
Yeah, I don't think I'm really talking any wider than what I put earlier.
Okay.
It's a large range, right? I mean, there's a when I look at it in my head at the the graph, the card graph or the solver or whatever, that bottom middle to right section, that those offsuit hands, the 3s and 4s and 5s, little triangle there, those are the ones that we're not really playing in the big blind position from what I think. So
okay.
So I mean, most of the hands, other than that small triangle section there at the bottom.
Okay. Yeah, I think that is more in line with the way I would want to express this. I think the other thing that's noteworthy, though, is that against an under the gun 9 player here, we do have to take note of the fact that it's very, very different defending against an under the gun 9-handed open compared to a button open. Even a player who's on the loose aggressive side, the only thing we would really want to do to adjust to that here is maybe assume that they are something like 2 positions wider in terms of their opening range. So we might assume that they have like an under the gun 7 opening range, or even a low jack opening range if we're going to be extremely aggressive with it. But even that, we would start to get to a point where it's not just those really weak offsuit hands that want to fold here. A hand like, let's say something like king, well, maybe most of the offsuit kings would probably call at 30 big blinds, but I think stuff like queen 7 off and below starts to become pretty iffy at this stack size. A lot of we still probably wouldn't be folding a suited hand here, but a couple of the things that I would have wanted to see as part of the explanation here, which hopefully you saw in the model answers, is we would want to address what the size of the open raise was, first of all. We would want to address what kinds of hands we're three betting, because that's a huge factor here in how wide our defense range can be. Establishing that threshold where we start to three bet or start to potentially, shove all in or whatever it is that we're going to do with our strong portion of our range and with some of our three bet bluffs or whatever, that has to be part of our consideration here as well. So you're not wrong that our defending range is going to be wide here, but this is definitely a very simplified description of what a strategy would look like. And I think we would want to make sure that you have a more fleshed out understanding of the different factors you're considering when it comes to big blind defense for a variety of spots, just because this is kind of one part of it, but almost any two cards would almost certainly be too wide. And then we want to get more into the complexity of it and what three bet hands do we have and things like that, Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And you said the opening size. I just assumed the standard opening size. I mean, if it be open to, 8 big blinds, and that's obviously different, right? So
sure, but it doesn't have to be that big of a change for it to be a big difference. Like 2 big blinds versus 2.2 versus 2.5, that affects things a pretty decent amount here. So that's the kind of thing that I would have liked to seen mentioned as well, right? And I specifically didn't mention the open size because I wanted to see if people were going to pick up on, okay, I'm defending wider against the 2x than I am against the 2.5 and so on, things like that. So that stuff is definitely important there. So the next one, explain why mixed strategies. Now, I think I should have been a bit more clear with the question here, which is really that this refers to sometimes betting and sometimes checking with the same hand in the same spot. So basically randomizing our action in a certain spot. I think nothing is like conceptually wrong about this answer, but I think in general here, the idea that, we play a certain hand one way and we shove with tens and win the pots, and then we call with tens later on, it'll be an unlikely scenario for us to have tens. But the thing is that this level of assumption about our opponent's exact thought process is I call it going too far down the rabbit hole, right? We're going way too far into thinking that we can read exactly what our opponents are thinking and what they're paying attention to and things like that. In general, we want to pay attention to the tendencies of the player pool for sure, but it's entirely feasible that, in fact, in a lot of situations, from one hand to another, circumstances can change such that in the first situation, shoving all in with tens and winning the pot, like that's completely correct for us to do. And then in the next situation, it's a different spot. It then also completely correct for us to, flat pocket tens in a certain type of situation because our stack size has changed or something like that. And so our opponent might make absolutely no assumptions whatsoever from those two hands. In fact, they probably shouldn't make any assumptions whatsoever, because if all you see your opponent do is make two separate plays that are both correct for different reasons in different situations, they can't really assume anything from that, right? So I think that this is kind of in keeping with some of what we saw earlier, where you're doing a little bit too much projecting what you think your opponents are actually thinking. And in fact, if you go to the model answer, you'll see the detailed explanation here. But really, mixing is the concept really refers to, in a specific situation, if we can identify that the value of checking and the value of betting, or the value of three betting and the value of calling, are both the same, then that would be a situation where mixing would be useful, because it ensures that our range is not going to be excessively weighted in one direction or another, or imbalanced, like I mentioned earlier. And it also helps to guard us against any kind of cognitive bias that comes up, because it's very, very easy to be the kind of player that whenever you have a close decision, you just always take the passive option or you always take the aggressive option. And if you do that, that's the point where your tendencies do start to become very noticeable. So that's kind of one of the things that we would want to consider that. Next one here. This one, I think, yeah. So this, you're right here. It's kind of funny that you arrived at very much an accurate assumption about what they are likely doing in terms of tendencies. They're likely a weaker recreational player. All of these things, like this is all very reasonable. But this is, again, a little bit too assumptive about their actual thought process, right? They may be cold calling because they want to see a flop and their money's already in the middle, but they also could be doing it for a bunch of other reasons. So why they're doing it is a lot less important than what they're doing it with. And this, assumption here of what their range likely could be is probably pretty accurate. But the why is less important than what, basically. So you did a good job there with that second part. Then we've got this question about merged range and a polarized range in a practical pre-flop 3-betting context. This is good in terms of the hand selection, assuming that this merged range also kind of is supplemented by the strong stuff, because there's not really going to be a spot where we only 3-bet the middle strength stuff. The thing that I would want to see here is identifying that it's all about where these hands are making money from, right? A polarized range, like we said before, it's making money from either getting action from worse or getting folds from better. There's no kind of murky in the middle sort of stuff. The merged range is where there's some murky stuff that maybe sometimes gets a better hand to fold, sometimes gets a worse hand to call. Something like a queen jack suited, you can sometimes get king queen off to fold, sometimes get jack 10 suited to call. That's kind of how a merged range operates there. And there's not going to be a spot where we 3-bet a certain range that's only middle strength hands, basically.
Yeah.
So this is number 16 here is, not a question that's going to be vital right now, but because it will flesh out once we start talking about that ace king queen game example. But in fact, with the answer, you're kind of mixing up pot odds with minimum defense. So minimum defense is, it's a game theory concept. It's all about how often you need to call against a certain bet with your bluff catchers to stop your opponent's bluffs from profiting. The concept that you've outlined is pot odds, which is about if you have a bluff catcher, how often does that bluff catcher need to win the pot to be a good call? So basically, minimum defense frequency is a concept for talking about the range level. So the overall strategy that you have, and it's primarily actually more useful offensively than defensively. It's more useful for attacking your opponents who are not defending their range often enough. And then pot odds is a hand level concept because it's about each individual hand within that range and whether or not that hand is going to be profitable to continue. So you've outlined a useful concept here, but you're slightly mixing up the two. And you're definitely not the only person who's done this in response to this question. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. It is just something that we'll address and we'll talk about it down the line. This one here with about bluffing, again, it's all accurate in a practical sense, but it's also kind of a simplified version here, which is that the full strategic role of bluffs here is, what I meant by this was essentially just that bluffing is the mechanism that allows us to actually get paid off when we have big hands. Bluffing in itself doesn't make a lot of money. What does make money is ensuring that our opponents don't have a reason to fold the second nuts when we have the nuts, right? That's the big picture of the purpose that bluffing serves. In a theoretical context, in a context where we know nothing about our opponents, our bluffs are break even. Our bluffs are breaking even in the long run. And our value bets are what's profiting. But if we don't bluff, our value bets don't make as much money because they don't get paid off. And of course, against opponents who make mistakes, we will sometimes profit with our bluffs, which is great. But that's a bonus. It's not the primary strategic role here. So in any situation where we bluff, we don't bluff just because we want them to fold. We bluff because in the bigger scheme of things, we want to ensure that we give our opponent an incentive to pay us off. So this next one, ICM, bubble. Yeah, this is, again, very accurate, but again, a little bit simplified. And it kind of ignores the fact that it's true that we have to call tighter, but this idea of we could go from a chip leader to a medium stack, like that's kind of true with any hand, right? That's true even if we have aces. So it doesn't really address how we make the evaluation of how much tighter we're going to be. With chip EV, I assume you can open a touch wider. I assume you mean call here, a touch wider. You're certainly right here. But I think it's interesting that you use this phrase, you're more interested in accruing chips, because really we're always interested in accruing chips. It's just a question of trade-offs, right? It's a question of what the potential downside versus the potential upside. So I think that I would highlight this just because I think we want to be careful we don't fall into a mindset that sometimes in a tournament we are not interested in accruing chips, right? We're always interested in accruing chips. It's just a question of where those trade-offs exist. This one here. Okay, so talk me through what it was that wasn't clear about the question here. You said you didn't really understand the question.
Well, a long time ago. I don't know now. Let me see here. Constructs logical framework for deciding whether to continuation bet multiplay after raising early position. I guess just the wording, constructing a logical framework. I don't guess I really understand what you mean by that part there.
Yeah, sure. You kind of did it for some of the earlier questions. It's really, I mean, the question about defending against a river bet, you already did it. It's just, what are the questions that we're considering? What are the factors that are relevant here? You know, what's the process that we're working through when we're making this decision? So it might start with, how many players are we up against? What's our position relative to these players? We're in early position. So are there, multiple players behind us? You kind of identified it there. Multiple players behind us is a bad thing. So we just want to kind of have a sequential progression of things that we're thinking about, right? As opposed to just, we kind of land in this spot and it's just kind of a mess of different ideas, So I think that you kind of did answer it in a certain kind of a way. You're considering various different factors here about if we have these types of hands, that we're not betting these types of hands. So you did partly go through that process. But there's a lot of stuff here that I would certainly be wanting to dig into some sort of exploration of how you're building ranges in certain spots, because things like we're not betting ace high on this board. Well, we should bet ace high sometimes. Like there's some ace high hands we can bet. We certainly can bet queen 10 sometimes. We certainly can or should bet a set sometimes. But if we're betting a set sometimes, we're not doing it to put pressure on flush draws, because our opponent's never going to fold a flush draw. Where if we're betting trips, if we're betting a set, we're betting it for value. We're betting it to get called by worse hands that we're way ahead of. If we have a set of nines, we're betting it to get called by top pair. Overpair, and again, also to go beyond that as well. Like if we're betting an overpair for value, it doesn't necessarily make sense that we would bet an overpair for value, but not bet a set for value, right? So this is kind of the logical framework. It needs to be that there, we want to figure out what our incentives are, what our reasoning is. And if we can bet an overpair, we might also be able to bet a set. But do we want to bet all of our overpairs, all of our sets? Just having a framework there is important. And we'll flesh this out for sure in future as well. And then finally, this one is, this is a very, realistic, sort of reasonable answer here. What I would have liked to see a little bit is a little bit more of the explanation of how or why these blockers influence our bluffing decisions. So basically, you identified blockers can help with the bluffing decision here, but sort of explaining like what kind of blockers we want to have. We want to have blockers to the hands that our opponent is going to call a bet with if we're bluffing. A good example here actually, it's kind of funny. Oh, no, okay. So we got the jack blocker on queen 10-4, ace 7. Okay. So yeah, that jack blocker is meaningful, but it also, we also have to evaluate in this specific case, does king jack exist in villain's range, at all, right? So it's an accurate explanation here. But I would like to see it go a little bit further to just explain kind of in certain contexts, we're going to primarily, particularly when there's a straight or a flush on the board, our bluffing range is mostly going to be built from hands that have blockers. And then in other situations, maybe we want to have unblockers, hands that are unblocking all the folding hands and so on. So just a little bit more detail, a little bit more fleshing out would have been nice here, but this is certainly implying that, you do understand the concept, obviously. So just kind of a little bit more detail is something to aim for. So I would probably say in terms of establishing some priorities here, I'm just going to write this down so I can priorities. We're going to go 1. So the ace, king, queen game, general theory and bluff catching explanations, just because it's going to help us to understand how to look at some river situations in particular, polarization as well. So that would be a good thing to focus on. I think ICM definitions and principles would be also a very useful thing. I think probably looking at big blind defense and 3-bet construction overall pre-flop would be good. And then for the post-flop concepts, I think just fleshing out turn and river, bluff construction, and bluffing principles, I guess, would also be a useful thing. So I think this is a structure that we can follow for the sessions that we have remaining that'll kind of shore up a lot of the areas where I think we saw, some stuff was kind of falling off or falling away a little bit. And I think this will really help to, particularly the second one, I think is going to just help to make sure that you have a really clear understanding of what our strategy priorities are in different situations in tournaments. And then, by the end of these sessions, we'll be in a position where, at least in a broad sense, a lot of the theory and a lot of the principles will be in place for you for these ideas. And then you'll be able to continue into your own study and continue extending the way that you look at these ideas in a sort of a fashion that is going to help you in your independent work away from coaching going forward. So that would be the structure that I would want to go with for the next sessions. And I think this next one, focusing on this general theoretical framework of the ace, king, queen game is certainly going to be important, because I think this will hopefully clarify and simplify a lot of stuff for you that relates to just the really big picture ideas in the game, and where a lot of our EV comes from, where a lot of our where our gains come from in terms of actually winning pots, having a positive win rate in various situations. So that would be I think the structure that I want to go with moving forward.
Man, I appreciate it.
Sound good. No worries. I'll create that channel for hand histories, and we'll talk about some hands.
Thanks, Matt. Have a good day, bud.
No worries. You too. See ya.